Okay, this is section 3.2 and it's called Life History Strategies. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some strategies that different organisms use to be successful throughout their lives in growing, reproducing, passing on their genes to the next generation. So we got a mama goose here and some babies following her. And let's talk about what the life history is all about. The life history is just the series of events that happen from birth through reproduction all the way to death. Now, what are these life history strategies? They are shaped by evolution, they are operating through natural selection, and they are adapted for specific environments. So, what do we mean by that? Let's take a look at this chimpanzee here. What are they doing? How many babies do they have? How do they take care of them? What are they doing in life to make themselves successful? All of the things that they're doing are shaped by millions of years of evolution and natural selection and adaptations. So things that were successful throughout time lasted and stayed and helped populations evolve over time, and things that were not successful didn't last. And so all of the histories and the strategies by these different organisms have come about through millions of years of practice. Okay, life history strategies influence the growth rate of a population. So here we have a picture of a sea turtle laying some eggs. She's going to cover those eggs up with the sand and go back out to the sea and never see those babies again. Why is she doing that? Well, we're going to figure that out. So life history strategies influence the age of first reproduction. If you're an organism, when do you first get to reproduce? The number of offspring you have, how much parental care do you give to those offspring, and how much energy does it cost you to reproduce? So, reproduction is an awfully expensive thing in terms of all the energy that has to be used by the offspring and also by the parent. So, all of these things, age of first reproduction, offspring, parental care, reproduction, all influenced by what the strategy is. So, we have two different patterns of reproduction existing amongst most different organisms. The first one is called R selection. And what this is you put energy into reproduction and not survival. So these organisms are putting a lot of energy into having as many offspring as they can. They're usually poor competitors. They're usually opportunists. They take advantage of favorable conditions and changes in the environment to have as many offspring as they can. And then, when favorable conditions are gone, the population might crash. And these populations sometimes go through irregular or unstable cycles. Now, why are these words in yellow on the slides here? If you want to shortcut your notes and not write everything, sometimes I'm giving you some keywords that you can write. So that is our selected reproduction pattern. Okay, the characteristics of our selected reproduction patterns would be these organisms are usually small. They reproduce when they're very young and they have a lot of offspring. And the offspring sometimes have very low survival. So tons of babies are being born, not many are surviving. There's little to no parental care. In other words, let's have as many offspring as we can, but we're not going to waste time on taking care of them. Usually these guys will represent exponential growth or show exponential growth as their population is growing. They usually live in unpredictable environments where things can change a lot. The environment is changing. And they are usually controlled by density independent factors. And what that means is that as things happen in the environment, sometimes they end up controlling the population size of these different organisms. So these are all characteristics of populations that employ that R strategy for how are we going to survive in life. We're going to just reproduce as much as we can, so many offspring, no parental care. And they also exhibit what's called the type 3 survivorship curve, and we will show you that in just a minute, so we'll take a look at what that is. Here's some examples of R selected species: bacteria, algae, most annual plants. Those are plants that grow in one season and then die, and then you have to get new seeds for next year. dandelions, here's an example. Most insects, like these cockroaches, fish, and oysters, all examples of species that employ R strategist. The other type of reproductive strategy is called K. K selected is different than R selected. And what do we have in K selected species? These guys put energy into long term survival, not into tons and tons of offspring. So there's a lot of parental care. So you see this penguin and this chick. The penguin's going to give a lot of care to that chick in hopes that that one chick will survive. These guys might be good competitors. They thrive best in ecosystems with fairly constant conditions, so not a lot of great crazy changes happening. And the populations usually remain close to the carrying capacity over a long period of time. So they're kind of staying in one place. So think about organisms putting a lot of parental care into a very few number of offspring. Okay, what are some characteristics here of K-selected species? Sometimes they're larger. They reproduce later in life, or they have fewer offspring, and most of those offspring will survive because there's a lot of parental care. So there's a lot of care going into making sure those babies survive. They live in predictable environments. They might be controlled by density dependent factors instead of independent, so things like competition, predation, and food and water. And they will exhibit something called a type 1 survivorship curve. I'm going to show you what that is in a minute. So now look at this little picture here. The RK scale of reproductive strategy, balancing egg output versus parental care. And you can see on the left-hand side of the page is R, and it says 500 million um, offspring a year for that organism. What is it, an oyster? Yes, it's an oyster. 500 million fertilized eggs a year. No parental care. The great ape on the other side of the picture is a K strategist. They produce one infant every 5 or 6 years, not very often at all. And they have a lot of parental care because they're putting everything into making sure that one baby survives. Here are some examples of some K strategists. Humans, obviously, that's what we are. Lots of parental care. Large trees, maybe like this one in the picture. Polar bears, elephants, most mammals and birds employ this type of strategy, and that's called K-selected. So two different strategies. Which one is better? And there isn't one that's better or worse. It is whatever works for that organism. So remember, all organisms are trying to just live long enough to reproduce and pass on their DNA and keep their kind alive. And so whatever works for them, that's what they're going to use. Okay, these are survivorship curves, and we're going to work with this in a lab, and we're going to do a little bit more with it in class. But what this is showing you here, if you look at this graph, on the x-axis is the percent of lifespan. So 20% of my life, 40%, 60, 80, or 100% of my life on the x-axis. And on the y-axis is the number of survivors. This is a logarithmic scale. So notice that the lines are not even. So we go from 0 all the way to 10, which is like half the graph. And then we go from 10 to 100 in a very small space, and 100 to 1,000 in an even smaller space. And that's why these curves will come out looking like they do, because the scale is fixed in a logarithmic way. So a type 1 survivorship curve is an example of that would be humans. What this is showing you is that at a very young age, you have a lot of offspring that are born. Let's say 1,000 individuals are born, and they are not dying very quickly. As we go to 20% of their lifespan, 40% of their lifespan, we still have a lot. We still have upwards of close to 1,000 individuals. And then as we get to 60% of their lifespan, we start going down because they are getting older. And then when they get old, they die off and they drop like this. So you can see when we get to 80% of our lifespan, we start falling off. So this is any example of any type 1 survivorship curve organism would be correlated with an organism that uses the K strategy. So not very many offspring, but lots of parental care. Now the opposite of that one, this is called a type 3 survivorship curve. An example here, it says plants, but you could also think of frogs or insects or cockroaches or a lot of organisms that have a lot of babies at first, But guess what happens in the very beginning of life? Not many of them are surviving. So many are dying. It's dropping off super quickly. And when it gets to about 20% of their lifespan, the drop off is a little more slow. But you can see that they have a lot of offspring, but not many are surviving. And that's what that curve looks like. And this is called a type 3 survivorship curve. Now, a type 2 survivorship curve is right here in the middle, and it's a straight line. And an example here is coral. Sometimes birds are an example here, because what this means is that when they have a lot of offspring, the drop off or the number of dying throughout their lives is about the same or consistent as you go along. So if we look at 20%, 40% of their lifespan, 60% of their lifespan, the number dying stays consistent. So that is a type 2 survivorship curve. And so we're going to work with these survivorship curves in lab and do a lab that represents these three types, hopefully, and you'll get to see a little example of how that works with organisms. What kind of survivorship do they exhibit? Okay, and that's kind of it with R strategists and K strategists and survivorship curves. And like I said, we will work with this more in class, and I hope that helps.